Welcome. We're doing another APTN, a retrospective, and we're back with Cullen Crozier, who's down from the Northwest Territories and joins us in our Winnipeg studio.
Yeah, good to be here.
Yeah, we're doing, this will air later, but you're down for training week.
Mm-hmm.
And so how are you liking training week so far?
Training week is always interesting, I guess. I don't know. It's actually with training week, besides the training that we get, I think it's just good to get the whole crew together, right? Because I work in a bureau, I work in Yellowknife, and we're kind of isolated there. And you speak with people over the phone here in the office. But anytime we can get the whole crew together, Investigates and national news, all the studio crew. I've been here 11 years, and I have a lot of friends here in Winnipeg that work for APTN. It's just good to see them again, and I find that a lot more rewarding sometimes than the actual training that we get.
Yeah, and I think that's always been a part of it. These training weeks, you just met Dan David for the second time, I think, right?
Yeah, was it the second day? It seems like it may have been more than that. But it's only when we come to Winnipeg that we do see him. But Dan's great. I think it's great to hear his voice and what the original vision for APTN was, and just getting to think about what is Indigenous storytelling. What are we doing here with news, with Investigates? Are we starting to kind of look too much like every other news organizations out there? Should we be doing that? Should we be doing something a little different? I think we do stuff different. I honestly do, but I enjoyed talking with him. Yeah, I thought that was great.
Yeah, I think it's that chance to, I mean, whether it's with your colleagues or whether it's with somebody like Dan, and we should say, Dan David is the father of APTN National News. He set up and he created this and started out with only 5 journalists and a small studio crew, and it built into a staff of 65 people today that do all these different shows and not just news. But he had a vision. He had come, he talked a little bit about this. He had spent some time in South Africa when apartheid was ending and people were getting control of their own media. And he was saying that they weren't changing very much. He went back and the papers were still covering the same things. They still had the same people in them, the same subjects. And when he was setting up APTN, he had this conversation with the original journalists saying, well, we could do journalism and we could be CTV and have all the same stories that CTV has or CBC has and be brown people doing them, or we could do something entirely different. We could choose different topics. We could take a look at how we tell our stories and be not advocates, but be journalists and be fact-based. But what is it that we would need to see to think about our stories as Indigenous news? And it's funny all these years, it's great not to have the answers sometimes.
I was going to say, if you're asking me, yeah, I don't have the answer for that. But something that Paul Barnsley says all the time with Investigates is he likes to say, if I've seen the story before, I don't want us to do it, which I don't necessarily agree with. I do understand what he's saying, and we do want to be breaking important stories. But just because a story was told, by the other guy, that doesn't mean it was told right or as well as we can tell it. People that we speak with, Indigenous people, a lot of times they'll open us up to us and they'll tell us stuff that they won't be telling mainstream media with, a big camera crew. So, I understand what he's saying there, but it's we could tell that story a lot better in some cases. So.
Well, and I mean, I guess that's a compelling argument as well. Sometimes Investigates has gone back and done a deeper dive, even into stories that news has told, because there's been episodes on, oh my gosh, I'm going to lose it for a minute, in the U.S.
Standing Rock. Standing
Rock, thank you. I was just brain dead on the name of the community. But going back and doing a deeper dive into that one, or after the Gerald Stanley decision came out, going and taking another look at the whole Colton Boushie case and how that unfolded, and what might have been happening in that town around it. So some of those like stories, even though they're kind of current, are sort of worth a deeper dive or a look at it from an Indigenous perspective. I think you're right.
Yeah, and from like I'm Indigenous, so like most of our reporters and VJs, it's about how we see the story as well. So anytime we could bring that to it, I think is important as well, and that makes it a little different than the mainstream, because we see the story in a completely different way a lot of the times.
So I'm wondering actually if we talk a bit about Forgotten Survivors, which is the episode that we did want to talk about this week on the retrospective. That kind of fits into one of those stories. Like, people knew that not everybody had been included in that apology. They weren't the only people left out. But maybe set it up a little bit for us.
Yeah. So with that story specifically, after the 2008 federal apology settlement agreement, there were schools, provinces, I guess, that were excluded from that agreement. Newfoundland and Labrador was one of them. Mm-hmm. And it was based on this, the fact that the residential schools that opened there had opened before 1949, before Newfoundland and Labrador became an official province, or joint confederation, I think is how they say. And that was the loophole that they used. They were like, well, those schools were already in operation before they became a province or before the federal government took responsibility, so that they're excluded for that. Even though after 1949, the feds were running the show. Essentially, they were responsible for those schools. So they kept making that argument, and that's why they were excluded. And that's when this 10-year battle to get recognized, to get an apology, that's where it started. With me, how I got into that story, I come from Yellowknife. I was with News before Investigates. And, I've had the honor over the years while I was with News of speaking with a lot of residential school survivors, having them share their stories with me. Yellowknife actually was home to the last residential school that was in operation at Acacia Hall. My mother actually went there, and I actually grew up right across the street from Acacia Hall, not really knowing it was a residential school. So I thought I had kind of a good understanding of residential school, the residential school experience over, my time in Yellowknife and, listening to my mom's stories and my work with APTN. Mm-hmm. But then I was just watching the news one night with my wife at home, and I seen this just offhand news story on Newfoundland and Labrador. I think it was, this lawsuit was going on, and it was just like a 2-minute story. And I was blown away, and I was like, Newfoundland and Labrador isn't recognized? I just didn't understand it. And I asked my wife, and she's kind of lived her father went to residential school, so she's got the experience as well in that sense. And she didn't know about it either. And that's kind of where it started for me. And I was like, well, what the hell's going on here? And that's when I started making phone calls and started looking into it. And I thought, we actually got a really big story here, because, again, it kind of goes back to the story was out there. I don't think it got the attention it deserved. And I just wanted to, again, just share their stories.
And we were talking about, I'm going to say, like last time we spoke, we are doing these back-to-back, so they won't air together. But through the magic of television, they will be weeks apart. But we were talking a little bit about visual storytelling and not having the history there. So, I mean, you do have people retelling their stories and talking about what they went through. You did walk through. The old building there is still standing, and I don't know, did you have to break a lock to get in? Like, it looked boarded up.
You'd think I'd almost have to. That was at the Yale School in Northwest River. Mm-hmm. In my research phase, I mean, that was kind of one of the things I looked at. It was, again, visual storytelling, right? So how many of these schools are still standing? A lot of them aren't. And
a lot of them also mysteriously burnt down.
Yeah.
And it may not be so mysterious that people were setting them on fire.
Yeah. But I came across this one. I forget what the building was in relation to the school, but it was the residential. It was what was left there. So I made a few calls. I think I had to go to, I think the city, somebody with the city had a key, and they said, yeah, you know, it's boarded up, be careful, but by all means, if you want to go in there. Just a really eerie, eerie play, like it's all boarded up. And, again, I'm on my own. I shoot all my own stories for the most part. So it's just me and my camera, and then you walk up these creepy stairs, and then the first thing you see is this massive mural with rainbows and animals, and it was just eerie as hell. And that I threw that in the story. I thought it was a real I spent over an hour in that place just walking through the rooms. They didn't all make it in the story, in the final cut. It was a creepy experience.
But it gives you that sense, like just seeing that, like it gave me that sense of, like, I mean, first of all, when you meet residential school survivors who are really, like, in a way, veterans for our people, they were the ones who, had fought colonialism with their bodies and their minds, but as children. So when we see them now, you kind of have to go back to they were children. And when you see that mural in the wall, it kind of reminds you of that. And when you see the camera going up the stairs, it gives you that forlorn feeling of a child being dropped off in a very institutional and strange place. And, you can never know what it felt like for them, but it gives you that little bit more of understanding that I think we're trying to create. So it's important to have that. There's another moment in that documentary that I thought, it's interesting because you have to be really careful with this stuff, because there's a moment, and I think you did it so well, but we didn't have any of them actually watching the apology in real time as it happened, and I cannot imagine what that would have been like for them to hear somebody finally apologizing, and it's not to them, it's to everybody except them. Like what a re-traumatizing moment it must have been for those survivors. And so what you did is you had them sort of out on the land, and you cut in between the apology and back to them. Yeah. And while that wasn't the moment that they would have experienced, you created a true feeling. I think that, like, when I was watching it, it really brought home to me something that I might not have had if you hadn't done that. I wasn't thinking, what was it like for them to sit and watch that apology happen that so many people waited for, and it's not theirs, and they're not sorry for them.
Yeah, and I don't know, again, it was a few years ago, I can't really remember how that idea came about, but yeah, you had Stephen Harper kind of saying all those famous words that he said, and people applauding, and then in between him saying that they're sorry, essentially, I got these like real tight kind of close-ups of these people that they didn't get that apology. And speaking with them, it was one thing that they told me over and again, everybody that I spoke with, was, we don't care about a settlement agreement. We don't care about money. What we want is, number one, recognition, because they're saying, like, they're not responsible and they haven't been recognized, and an apology. It seems like a simple thing. Like, we want to be recognized, and we'd want an apology more than any other part of it. So, it was, again, setting that up. I'm glad it worked out the way it did. So.
Yeah, and I remember something that Phil Fontaine said, because he negotiated the original apology, and he was always very careful when that was happening to say people are going to receive the apology. He never said that they were going to accept the apology, because he knew that, like, even sorry, no amount of money, no amount of sorry is ever going to be enough to make people like okay with this, or to feel what they need to feel, right? So at this point, they've been left out of that original one, and so they have not received the apology. I'll use that language. And they were still in the courts when you were there, but maybe just tell us what happened since.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they fought. I think the lawsuit was launched relatively close after the apology, and they fought the federal government under the Conservatives for the most part for about 10 years. And I remember speaking with the lead lawyer, one of them, Stephen Cooper. He said it was the most basically that the federal government conceded nothing, and they fought him harder than anybody has ever fought him in his like 25-year career, and that it just kind of goes to show just their attitudes at that time. When the Liberal government came in with this renewed kind of nation to nation and settling these past travesties that took place, I think a lot of the Newfoundland Labrador residential school survivors, they thought, okay, maybe we will get a chance at this. I think it still took maybe 2 years after Liberals came to power before eventually they did settle, and there was a formal apology for what happened. So I'm not sure the exact year that happened, but it did happen.
Yeah, we went live when Trudeau made the apology, and it just seems like such a I guess the frustration in watching that original story that you did is it seems so frustrating because it's already been won in courts. They're going to drag it out in courts. Both sides are going to spend a whole bunch of money, and you kind of know where they're going to end up. They're going to end up that there's going to be an apology and there's going to be a settlement. So it's just like why drag them through again?
Yeah,
and that was so frustrating to watch.
And I think when I was telling the story up until that point, the Newfoundland Labrador residential school survivors were the only survivors in the country, something like that had to testify in a court of law about their experiences and what they went through in a court of law. So, and then to be cross-examined or I don't know. It's just like you said, why drag them through? Why put them through all that for all those years to, like you said, to get where we know what's right.
And it's something when we're covering these stories that we think about a lot is when we go out and we interview vulnerable people. Are we going to re-victimize them? How do we make sure? Because it's not like we can hook them up with a social worker or an elder or something like that, to make sure they're okay when we leave. Yeah. And we go back to our jobs, and sometimes, we don't feel great about it, and the studio crew watching doesn't feel great about it. And we have our own ways of handling our mental health here when we cover these stories. But, what are you thinking about when you're interviewing a vulnerable person? Yeah,
and you do have to be careful because that's a real possibility, and that happens actually more often than not. I've gotten to a place in my career, and when I speak with people, again, it's usually just me. With that Newfoundland Labrador trip, it was just me and my camera. But, it's about building that trust again, and long before I hit record or long before, I set up the camera, I'm sitting there talking and I'm just letting them know that, even when we're setting it up, I always let them know that, if you do want to have a family member with you, we are going to be talking about some very traumatic experiences. If you want somebody with you, just for that, just to have someone there, that's no problem. I don't mind that at all. Because we are going to be talking about the most traumatic experience in your life, and about building that trust though, and getting them there. But you're right, it's you got to be careful, and I hope that I can give them enough kind of comfort or put them at ease where they're comfortable sharing their stories again. On the flip side, I go back to my office and I'm living with that story, just reliving it almost day to day, hour to hour as I'm putting the story together. You're hearing these stories over and over. So that's difficult a lot of times as well. And our own mental health is important as well. So anytime you can step away from the story for a bit and take a breather, that's always great.
Yeah, we've got programs for our reporters here where they can talk to an elder or they can talk to kind of a more Western social worker if that's what they like. You know, and I think we just do like a lot of coaching, you know, to try to make it supportive as possible. You know, and I guess, you know, like with you know, maybe we could just end on advice for interviewees. Like, we do tell people, if you want a family member there, have a family member there. And, you know, hopefully we're encouraging them also to think about, if you're not going to feel okay after this, like, just think about it, you know. But if a reporter doesn't ask you, you know, you know, and you're worried about how you're going to feel after an interview, you know, like, there's some things that you can do. You can say, can I bring family members in? Can I bring my support system in? And to make sure that you have things set up afterwards.
Definitely, yeah. It's really important. And again, that's what I tell everybody that I'm speaking with: is by all means, have them come in as long as you're okay. Then I'm game. So.
Okay. Well, and thank you for talking to me today.
Yeah. Thank you.